I was 14 when this happened, and even though I'm 22 now, the whole thing is still clear in my mind. I think about it sometimes, and wonder how close I came to something I don't even want to imagine. It was summer break, and I had finally convinced my mom to let me spend a couple of months in Russia with my grandparents. We'd moved to North America when I was young, and I hadn't been back in years. The idea of taking a long international flight by myself felt exciting and a little grown up, so she agreed to it. My grandparents were thrilled I wanted to visit. They've always spoiled me and my mom, and they planned a small getaway for the three of us about a month after I arrived. They booked 2 weeks at a fancy resort in Turkey, right outside Ankara. I couldn't believe I was going to see 2 countries in one summer. 14-year-old me thought that was the coolest thing ever. But if I'm being honest, the first month in Russia didn't live up to the picture I had in my head. My grandparents meant well, but they were very protective, and they didn't let me go anywhere alone. The days blended together. I spent most of my time in their apartment playing on my PSP. At home, I was used to going for jogs every day, and they wouldn't let me even think about doing that by myself. They tried coming with me a couple of times, but it didn't work. They just weren't able to keep up. So when it came time to fly to Turkey, I was more than ready for a change of scenery. The resort was huge, with gardens that wrapped around the property, tall trees everywhere, and trails that were perfect for morning runs. This time I had my own room, and I took advantage of that freedom right away, wandering around the grounds and figuring out where everything was. I started jogging early in the mornings when the heat wasn't so intense. I'd put in my earphones, blast music on my old iPod, and run loops through the gardens. It seemed safe enough. The place was full of families and tourists, and the entire resort was fenced off from the rest of the city. That's when I first noticed the gardener. He looked to be in his late 40s or early 50s, skinny, weathered, sunburnt, always in the same green uniform. He'd wave or say something in broken English as I passed, and I'd wave back without thinking much of it. The interaction always felt harmless, just staff being friendly. About 10 days in, everything had settled into a nice routine. I was finally enjoying myself, eating whatever I wanted, swimming, exploring, and my grandparents weren't hovering as much. They didn't know about my morning runs. There was no way they'd approve, so I kept that part to myself. One morning, around 7, I was doing my usual loop when I saw the gardener again. But this time he wasn't trimming shrubs or watering anything. He was standing at the start of one of the side paths, waving at me like he needed something. I took my earphones out, thinking maybe he was trying to warn me about work being done or point out something. He motioned for me to come closer. Since he worked for the resort, I didn't think too hard about it. I walked toward him, and he held a rose out to me. "Rosa," he said, smiling. I took it, confused, thinking maybe he was trying to show me something blooming deeper in the garden, or was just being polite. But then he stepped back, still holding another flower, and gestured for me to follow him farther down the trail. It wasn't until I moved closer that I saw he had one hand behind his back. When I glanced up the path, I noticed a small shed tucked between the trees, the kind of place where equipment was stored. Something tightened inside me, like my brain finally caught up to what my instincts were trying to tell me. I stopped moving immediately. He smiled again and repeated, "Rosa," lowering the second flower and taking a small step toward me. That's when I saw the rag in his other hand. I didn't wait to see what he planned to do. I dropped the rose, turned around, and ran as fast as I could back toward the resort. I didn't look back until I reached the lobby doors. Once I was inside with other people around me, I finally turned to check if he'd followed. He wasn't there. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely swipe my room key. I didn't tell my grandparents what happened. I didn't want them blaming themselves or canceling the rest of the trip. And honestly, I didn't want to deal with the panic I knew they'd fall into. I just stayed right by their sides for the rest of the vacation and pretended nothing was wrong. I saw the gardener once more, near the beach. He was talking to a security guard. When he noticed me, he smiled like we were sharing some private joke. Then he mouthed, "Rosa," at me again. I stared back and didn't move. Eventually, he walked away, and I forced myself to act normal. I never jogged again during that trip, and for a long time after that summer, I found myself avoiding early morning runs. I was around 22 when this happened, traveling for work with a photography company that went from town to town, taking church directory photos. Back then, I was always living out of hotel rooms, driving my own car across states I barely remembered passing through, and sharing these temporary stops with a rotating mix of other photographers. That week, we were in Harlan, Iowa. Nothing remarkable about the place, just another quiet town with a modest hotel where the four of us, 2 guys, another girl, and me, stayed between long workdays. One morning, I went downstairs for the free breakfast, half awake and trying to focus on the news playing on the TV in the lobby. There was a guy already there eating by himself, someone I hadn't seen before. When he looked over, I greeted him automatically, the way I usually do in public places where everyone pretends they aren't strangers for a moment. He answered back and said he was in town with a construction crew. It was the sort of forgettable conversation that's over in seconds, and on my way out I tossed out a casual, "Have a good one," without thinking. He said something about hanging out later, which I brushed off the way you do when someone says it just to say it. I didn't start putting things together until a few hours afterward. I had the morning free because my shift didn't start until late morning, so I went back to my room hoping to catch up on sleep after a rough night. Not long after I lay down, the hotel phone rang. It never rang, ever, so I thought maybe it was work calling with some change of plans. But when I picked up, no one spoke. This happened again, then again, until I finally left the receiver off the hook so I could rest without the interruption. When it was time to leave, I stepped out and saw him standing in the hallway. He greeted me like we'd been in the middle of some ongoing conversation, asking where I was heading. I didn't think much of it at first, still assuming it was just coincidence that he was nearby, so I told him I was headed to work. My friend arrived a minute later, so I went with her to the car. I mentioned the weird phone calls, and she said she had gotten some too. Later that night, a storm rolled through. Heavy lightning, loud thunder, the kind of weather that makes you stand near the lobby doors out of habit just to watch the sky. We all stayed downstairs for a bit, keeping an eye on the warnings because there was talk of tornadoes nearby. Once things calmed down, we drifted back to our rooms. A short while later, there was a knock on my door. I wasn't expecting anyone, but figured it was one of the photographers. I cracked the door open, and it was him, the construction guy from breakfast. He brought up the comment I'd made about maybe hanging out, acting like we'd made plans. I told him I was exhausted and needed to sleep, then closed the door. Something in his tone had thrown me off, though I couldn't pinpoint why at the time. I don't remember if it was later that night or the next morning, but at some point he knocked again. This time I didn't answer. I called my mom, partly because I needed someone to talk to, and partly because it made the room feel less empty. While I was on the phone, I suddenly got a strong feeling that something wasn't right, and whispered to her that I needed to check something. I walked quietly to the door and looked through the peephole. He was standing right there. Not knocking, not leaving, just standing. Then he turned his head toward my door like he was listening. My stomach tightened, and I stepped away from the peephole for a second because I didn't want my movements to give anything away. When I looked again, he had shifted into the recessed part of the hallway near my door, like he thought he was out of sight. He kept leaning just enough to peek toward my room, as if he was waiting for a sound or movement. I moved to the furthest corner of my room and whispered into the phone, telling my mom exactly what he was doing. I called the front desk, and I'm pretty sure I messaged my friend too, because she called them as well, mentioning her phone calls and the hallway behavior. The hotel eventually switched our rooms and notified the construction crew's manager. That guy was apparently told to stay away from us, and after that I didn't see him again. My friend's new room ended up having a hot tub, which felt unfair considering the whole situation. But I didn't care enough to complain. I just wanted the whole thing over with. Afterward, I watched myself more carefully, not in a paranoid way, just more aware of how even small, casual conversations can take a turn you don't expect. Last fall sits in my memory as one of the strangest stretches of downtime I've ever had. For the past few years, I've bounced between seasonal jobs that let me spend summers working in the kinds of places people usually only visit on vacation, camping out for months at a time, and then shifting into whatever winter position offered housing. Because of that setup, I don't really have a permanent place. I just rotate between a tent and whatever free room the next job provides, which seems normal enough when you're a guy in his mid-20s living cheap. The only awkward window is late September into October, when summer work ends and winter gigs haven't started yet, and it starts getting cold enough that sleeping in a tent loses its charm. Last October, I had a couple of weeks to kill before moving into my winter job's housing. I had been splitting my nights between different friends' couches while trying to stretch my savings, but after going to a friend's wedding, I caught some brutal flu that knocked me completely out. I almost never get sick, so waking up with no voice, sweating through my clothes, aching everywhere, and feeling like my throat was made of sandpaper, pushed me past the point of toughing it out. I decided I'd spend a little extra money on a motel room for a night or two. It wasn't fancy, but it was clean, and it was the style where each room opens directly to the outside. I took a long bath, wrapped myself in the blankets, and honestly felt relieved to just be somewhere warm and still. Not long after settling in, the guy in the room next to mine came back and slammed his door so hard it rattled the wall between us. He immediately started yelling on the phone, full volume screaming, and it didn't take long to piece together that he'd been fired from his job and was yelling at whoever had let him go. He kept ranting about someone's truck and making vague threats, breaking things in his room loud enough that I could hear stuff hitting the floor. Anyone with common sense probably would have called the cops, but I'd already smoked a little weed to deal with the fever and aches, and I didn't feel like getting into it with law enforcement over a sick day coping mechanism. Eventually things went quiet next door. Then, out of nowhere, I heard a heavy crash loud enough that for a second I wondered if the guy had done something to himself. By then it was around 9. I was exhausted, a little out of it from NyQuil and the weed, and honestly just glad he wasn't screaming anymore. I was on the edge of falling asleep when I heard a soft tapping on my door. I ignored it, thinking maybe he broke something and was messing around with tools or whatever. Then it happened again. Tap, 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 louder this time. My dog barked. I looked through the peephole and didn't see anyone, so I tried to brush it off and went back to bed. A few minutes later there was a sharper, faster set of knocks, and right as I sat up, annoyed and paranoid at the same time, I heard someone whisper, almost like he was trying not to wake the whole motel, "Bro, let me smoke some." It hit me that I had a choice. Either ignore him and risk him getting annoyed enough to complain or call the cops, or open the door and deal with whatever this was. In my sick, foggy state, opening the door somehow felt like the easier of two bad options. I barely got my hand on the knob before the door flew inward, and the guy pushed his way inside. He was maybe mid-30s, jittery, and holding an open knife like it was nothing. Before I could even process that, he started firing off questions. "Who else is in the room?" I told him it was just me and my dog. He didn't believe me and made me repeat myself. He was restless and scattered, eyes darting everywhere, and whether it was drugs or him being off his meds or just something else entirely, I couldn't tell. He made me show him the bathroom to prove no one was hiding. Every few seconds he'd warn me what would happen if I lied. Trying to think clearly while sick, high and exhausted was borderline impossible. Once he was satisfied the room was empty, he switched gears, holding the knife near my dog and asking over and over if I had any idea who he was. He claimed he was with the FBI, said I was involved in something, and tried to make it sound like he was doing me some kind of favor by being there. The whole thing dragged on long enough that I realized letting him ramble wasn't helping. I finally told him it didn't make much sense for an undercover agent to kick in someone's door because he wanted to smoke weed. He jammed the knife into the table so hard it stuck there and started lecturing me about federal operations, which only confirmed how disconnected from reality he was. I figured the only chance I had was to steer him towards something that wouldn't escalate things. I told him I didn't know what he was trying to accomplish, and if he wanted to smoke just to calm down, fine, but I was sick and needed to sleep. That seemed to redirect him. He made me pack the bowl and take the first hit to prove it wasn't poisoned. Then he took his turn, coughing for a good minute straight. He suddenly went from hostile to friendly, folded the knife, tried to give me a hug, and asked if I wanted to go to the bar with him. I whispered that I was too sick, which was obvious from my voice, and he nodded like he finally understood. Then he walked out. His room stayed completely quiet for the rest of the night. When I finally got back into bed, the whole thing felt so surreal that I honestly questioned whether it had actually happened or whether it was some fever dream. In the morning, I noticed the knife mark in the table, and that was enough confirmation. Before anyone jumps on me for smoking in a motel room, yeah, I knew it wasn't ideal, but I also knew the smell would be gone by morning, and I just needed something to take the edge off the fever and aches. It did help, just not in the way I expected. The part I didn't plan for was being cornered by a guy with a knife who wanted to hit more than he wanted to stay sane. My girlfriend and I booked a cheap motel for 2 nights because we were trying to save money, and the place wasn't great, but it was good enough. I was 20 and she was 19, and we just needed somewhere to stay for a quick trip. The first night was uneventful, and we figured we made the right call by choosing the inexpensive option. The second night proved otherwise. Sometime around midnight, someone started pounding on our door. I checked the peephole and saw a short, wiry-looking guy outside. He had jeans on, no shirt, and he looked rough enough that drugs were the first thing that crossed my mind. I assumed he was just knocking on random doors trying to get attention or money or whatever he was after. Since he eventually stopped, I tried not to think too much about it and went back to bed. Around 2 a.m., while my girlfriend Jane and I were finally drifting off, I heard a voice outside, low at first, but unmistakable. It sounded like the same man, and I could have sworn he said, "You and your girl are gonna die tonight." For a few seconds I tried convincing myself I imagined it. It felt too strange and too specific to be real. But then I started wondering if he had seen us earlier, or had been hanging around the hallway longer than I realized. Jane was asleep, and I didn't want to wake her unless I had to, but my nerves were already shot, so I nudged her and whispered that he might still be out there. She thought I was overthinking it, until the knocking started again. We both went to the door and looked through the peephole. He was standing right in front of our door, his back to us, hands behind him like he was standing at attention. That was enough for me. I grabbed the motel phone and called the police. Jane still thought I might be jumping to conclusions, but she didn't try to talk me out of it. I also called the motel lobby, but they told me they couldn't do anything and to let the police handle it. About 10 minutes later, a police cruiser rolled through the parking lot, then drove away without stopping. I guess they didn't see him. A few minutes went by quietly until he started talking again, louder this time. "Man, you called the cops? You're a pussy. I'll kick your ass." Then silence again, long enough to make us hope he'd wandered off. That didn't last. His voice came back, and he repeated the same line about killing us, and this time Jane heard it clearly. Any doubt she had vanished instantly, and she insisted on calling the police again. She was shaken enough that she explained things far more urgently than I had earlier. Another cruiser came, drove through, and looked like it was about to leave again. I didn't want to stay trapped in the room a third time, so I stepped outside and waved them down. I felt safe enough to do it since they were right there. The officers told me they had talked to the man but didn't see anything criminal. Apparently he'd been messing with the air conditioner outside our room, but that wasn't enough for them to do anything. I tried telling them exactly what he'd been saying, but they said they didn't have grounds to arrest him. So they left a second time, and now the guy was furious. He must have seen me talking to the police because he came back to the door, yelling about how I was a coward and threatening me again. I called the police for the third time, hoping they'd finally take it seriously. After about 15 minutes, we heard people moving around outside, and then the distinct sound of handcuffs. I can't explain the relief that washed over both of us. We heard him protesting, saying he hadn't done anything, but they took him anyway. The moment the police car pulled away, Jane and I made a quick decision to grab our stuff and leave. We weren't staying there another minute. Luckily, my friend was awake at 4 a.m. and let us crash at his place. As we were pulling out of the lot, I glanced at the police car parked nearby. The man was in the back seat, staring at us through the window. It wasn't anger or confusion. It was just a blank, hollow stare that still sticks with me when I think about that night. My wife and I took a short vacation to Mexico, and honestly, we were having a great time up until this one moment that made both of us rethink how relaxed we were being about security. We just finished dinner and walked back to our hotel, still talking about the food and what we wanted to do the next day. Once we got inside the room, we started putting our stuff down, turning on a couple lights, nothing out of the ordinary. A few quiet minutes went by, the kind where you're just settling in after being out. Then we heard a knock at the door. It wasn't loud or rushed, just a quick knock followed by a low voice saying something in Spanish, the kind of tone you'd expect from someone trying to sound official, like they were announcing room service. My wife looked at me with that "who would that be" expression, especially since we weren't expecting anything from the hotel. Worth mentioning, we had the "Do Not Disturb" tag hanging on the door the entire time. A few more seconds pass, and there's another knock. My wife gestures for me to check, so I walk over quietly. We hadn't said a single word out loud since the first knock. No footsteps, no rustling, nothing that would give away that we were standing right there. Just as I reached the door, the lock beeped and the door handle turned. The door actually opened. A man I'd never seen before, dirty clothes, unkempt appearance, was suddenly standing right in front of me, maybe 2 feet away. I immediately put my hand on the door to stop it from opening any further. He looked caught off guard too, like he expected the room to be empty and didn't expect someone to be right on the other side. He started speaking Spanish quickly, and I caught the word Wi-Fi somewhere in the middle of it. I told him I didn't speak Spanish, and then in broken English, he tried to ask if our Wi-Fi wasn't working. My wife answered from behind me that ours was fine, but the whole thing felt strange in a way that was hard to shake off. I kept my hand braced on the door while he mumbled a little more, and then walked away. The moment the door closed, I locked the physical latch and double-checked it. Normally, I always lock it right when we come in, but we had only been inside for a minute or two, and were distracted with unpacking. My wife and I talked it through, and we both came to the same conclusion. This wasn't someone checking on Wi-Fi. He knocked, got no answer, and let himself in with a master key card. He didn't expect us to be there, and if we hadn't been, we probably would have come back to missing belongings. If we had been asleep, we might not have heard anything at all. After a couple minutes of processing how close that came to going badly, I called down to the front desk and told them exactly what happened. They sounded concerned and said they would look into it, though we never heard anything more after that. Even now, thinking back on it, the timing is the part that sticks with me. If we had walked in a few minutes later, we might have surprised someone already inside our room. If we were out longer, we might have returned to find our things gone. If we had gone to bed right away, we might have slept right through him letting himself in. The whole thing could have played out so many different ways. From now on, everything goes straight into the safe, and the moment we walk into any hotel room, anywhere, the physical lock is getting engaged immediately. Learned that lesson the hard way, but at least nothing actually happened beyond a close call. We're still enjoying the trip, but with a different mindset now. My fiancé Will and I took a short trip to upstate New York a couple of weeks ago, mostly just to get out of town for a few days and reset. The hotel we picked wasn't anything special. The place had that worn-down look where the carpets never quite feel clean, and the lighting makes every hallway feel a little older than it probably is. But the price was good, and they offered smoking rooms, so we figured it would work for a quick stay. We got back from dinner late one evening, sometime around 11. Will mentioned he wanted a soda before bed, and since the place didn't have elevators, we headed for the vending machines on the lower floor. The first flight of stairs brought us to this stretch of hallway that seemed to go on forever, the kind of layout that makes you feel like you're walking inside a maze. As we started down it, I noticed one of the room doors was wide open. I didn't think much of it until we got closer. Out of habit, I glanced inside, and that's when I saw her. An older woman standing in the middle of a dark room, no TV on, no light except whatever spilled in from the hallway. She was tugging at her hair with both hands while smiling in this fixed, unnatural way. It didn't look playful or confused or anything that could be brushed off. It was the kind of expression that makes something feel instantly wrong before you've even had time to process it. My chest tightened, and I sped up a little. Will hadn't noticed her at all, and was still walking normally. He looked around and said, "I think we went the wrong way. Let's turn around." I didn't look back into the room when we passed it again. I just focused on reaching the end of the hallway. When we finally slowed down, I leaned toward him and whispered, "There's something off in one of those rooms. Something's really wrong." He stopped and started to ask what I meant, but then we noticed a sign on the wall pointing back toward the vending machines. And of course, they were located near that same room. So we turned around again, already uneasy, and halfway down the hall we saw something stretch out of the woman's doorway. Her arm, moving slowly, drifting side to side in a way that didn't look like any kind of normal wave. Almost like she was testing the air or trying to feel around for someone. Before either of us could say a word, her door slammed shut, and we heard several locks snap into place from the inside. I told Will I really didn't want to walk past that room again. He tried to reassure me, reminding me the vending area was right next to the lobby, and we could go straight to the desk if anything happened. So we pushed on, past the room without stopping, and made it into the small vending area, tucked behind a few heavy doors. I dug through my pockets for change and started feeding coins into the machine, one after another. I only had nickels and dimes, so it was taking forever. While I was staring at the coin slot, a feeling crept over me like someone was standing just close enough to be watching. I turned toward the doorway, and she was there. The same woman, smiling like before, her expression stretched wide, standing completely still while she watched us. What made it worse was the route she had to take to get there. 3 heavy doors that made loud, dragging sounds when we'd gone through them earlier. Somehow she slipped through all of them silently. Will and I both froze. I stopped putting coins in the machine and just kept my eyes forward, barely breathing. Then she let out this high, breathy giggle, like a child trying to hold back laughter. Out of the corner of my vision, I saw her cover her mouth with both hands, her shoulders lifting in a way that didn't match her age at all. The sound of it hit me harder than anything she had done before. It was so out of place and so intentional that my eyes started watering on their own. She giggled for another second, then simply turned around and walked away without saying a word. Will grabbed the soda the moment it dropped, and we didn't bother pretending to be calm. We left the vending area, sprinted through the hallway, up 4 flights of stairs, and locked ourselves inside our room. I pushed a chair under the door and barely slept the rest of the night. We checked out the next morning. Never saw her again. When I was a kid, my mom used to spend a lot of time at casinos, which meant we were always getting free hotel rooms at different places. I didn't really understand the gambling part back then. I just knew these little trips felt like small vacations. I loved getting out of the house, wandering around the big lobbies, and swimming in pools that were way nicer than anything I had at home. Every now and then I'd even meet other kids, and we'd spend hours playing Marco Polo or making up games until the pool closed for the night. Most days were predictable in a comforting way. I'd grab a sweet drink from the cafe downstairs, head straight to the pool, and stay there until my fingers got wrinkly or I got tired. Nothing strange ever happened, just the kind of harmless, repetitive routine that felt like a break from real life. But one afternoon stood out for all the wrong reasons. I was sitting on one of the lounge chairs near the edge of the pool, legs dangling off the side, just taking a break. A man who looked much older than me, easily in his 30s, walked over and started talking. At first, he sounded friendly enough, but even at that age I could tell something about his approach was off. He kept insisting he recognized me from somewhere, even though I knew without a doubt that I had never seen him before. The way he said it didn't sound like a genuine mistake. It sounded like someone trying to ease into a conversation they had no reason to start. Then he told me he was in the military and asked if I wanted to go up to his room to see his uniform. Hearing that, everything in my head clicked into place. Even as a 10-year-old, I knew that no grown man should be inviting a kid upstairs for any reason, let alone to look at something he could have easily just described. I forced a small smile and told him I was about to get back in the pool and wouldn't be going anywhere. He didn't seem bothered by the brush-off. Instead, he told me he'd just go put the outfit on and come back down to show me. The moment he walked away, I grabbed my towel and headed straight for one of the workers near the entrance. I told her exactly what he said. She looked uncomfortable but serious, and told me she'd handle it. About 10 or 15 minutes later, he walked back into the pool area, wearing what was supposed to be a military uniform, but it looked like something bought last minute online. The fabric, the patches, everything about it looked wrong. He stood by the edge of the water trying to get my attention again, but he didn't get more than a few words out before one of the hotel employees approached him. She spoke quietly but firmly, and within seconds he was being escorted out. I didn't see him again after that. At the time, I didn't fully understand how dangerous that situation could have been. I just knew it felt wrong, and I wanted an adult involved. Looking back, I'm grateful that even at 10 years old I trusted that feeling enough to speak up.